I'd like to tell you about a book you might want to check out. It's Kingdom of Speech by Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe earned his PhD at Yale. He wrote over 12 books. Some of them you may have heard of: The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, The Right Stuff, Bonfire of the Vanities. He started off as a journalist and later became a novelist. This was towards the end of his life, and he returned to nonfiction. Reading from the back cover, language in all its forms advanced man far beyond the boundaries of natural selection, allowing him to think abstractly and plan ahead. No animal was capable of it. Measure things and record measurements for later. No animal was capable of it. Comprehend space and time, God, freedom, and immortality, and to be able to remove items from nature to create artifacts, whether they be axes or algebra. No animal could even begin to do such a thing. Darwin's doctrine of natural selection couldn't deal with artifacts, which were, by definition, unnatural, or with the mother of all artifacts, which was the Word, the inexplicable power of the Word, speech, language, and it was driving him crazy. Reading a little bit from the book, it's very interesting. Gives you an idea of who Darwin was and how he got started. Charles Darwin's father, Robert Darwin, was a doctor, like his father, Arrhenius Darwin. His true passion, however, was investing, lending, brokering, betting, and otherwise dealing in the Industrial Revolution's money markets, and he made an absolute fortune, then multiplied it by marrying a daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, one of the early giants of the industry. Wedgwood was a potter, a craftsman, who had created factories that produced chinaware finer than any plain potter ever dreamed of. Robert Darwin's arena was London and its financial district, the city. But like most, the great British industrial revolutionaries, he chose to live in the countryside on a large and largely irrelevant estate. His in Shropshire, which was called the Mount, to show he was as grand as the landed gentry of yore. He paid for his son Charles to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh, but the boy dropped out. Then he sent him to Christ's College at Cambridge to become a clergyman. The boy dropped out. Then they had to settle for the boy dropping down to the bottom at Cambridge and barely getting a Bachelor of Arts degree, without honors or the vaguest idea of what to do with his life. And then begrudgingly paid for the boy to enjoy a 5-year voyage of exploration or sightseeing or something aboard a boat named for a dog, His Majesty's ship Beagle, to prepare him for a career in the field of, as far as Dr. Darwin could tell, nothing. Once the boy was finished with that nonsense, Dr. Darwin, who himself had married a Wedgwood relative, nudged the boy, who was now 29, into marrying in 1839 his perfectly nice, if plain, 30-year-old spinster first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and in 1842 bought them a country place, Down House, southeast of London, and settled enough money on him for the boy to live well forever and ever. Living well included 8 or 9 servants, a butler, a cook, a manservant or 2, a parlor maid, a lady maid, and at least 1 nanny and a governess, from day one. He started thinking about evolution. Transmutation was the term for it at the time, when he was on the Beagle. By 1837, the year after the expedition had ended, he was convinced that all plants and animals on Earth was the result of transmutation, i.e. evolution, of all the various species over millions of years, and not just plants and animals. The Beagle explorers spent long intervals on the land, and Darwin kept coming upon natives so primitive that they struck a British gentleman like himself as closer to apes than humans, particularly the Fuegians. The Fuegians were natives of Terra del Fuego, an Argentine and Chilean province so far south that the tip at the bottom is part of Antarctica. The Fuegians were brown and sun-wrinkled and hairy. The hair on their heads was as wild and as howling. A howling as a hairy ape's. The hairy legs were too short, and their hairy arms too long for their hairy torsos. In Darwin's eyes, the only thing that distinguished the Fuegians from the higher apes was the power of speech, if you could call theirs a power. The Fuegian vocabulary was so small that their grunt-sunken grammar was so simple and simple-minded, it was rather a lame distinction to Darwin's way of thinking. He had no idea yet that speech, whether grunted by brutes in the middle of nowhere or intoned by toffs in London, was by far, very far, the greatest power possessed by any creature on earth. Now, mind you, all this book was taken from Darwin's own writings and things that he told his friends and what they wrote down about it. It certainly wasn't scientific experimentation or observation that finally convinced Darwin that man had no special place in the universe. It was a visit to the London Zoo in the spring of 1838, 2 years after the voyage of the Beagle. One of the zoo's most popular attractions was an orangutan named Jenny. Jenny had become so used to being around people that many of her reactions had become absolutely human in nature. Sometimes she wore clothes. Her gestures, her facial expressions, the sounds she made, the way she acted out frustration, mockery, anger, and guileless glee, or I love you, help me, and I want gestures, this last with a whine that made one see how hard she was struggling to put it all into words. It was clear as day. Now Darwin was certain. Jenny was a human being behind the flimsiest of veils. And he used his clout as a gentleman and a leading naturalist to enter Jenny's cage and study her expressions close up. There were 5 standard tests for a scientific hypothesis. Had anyone observed the phenomenon? In this case, evolution, as it occurred and recorded it. Could other scientists replicate it? Could any of them come up with a set of facts that, if true, would contradict the theory? This was called Karl Popper's Falsifiability Test. Could scientists make predictions based upon it? Did it illuminate hitherto unknown or baffling areas of science? In the case of evolution, well, no, 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 and no. In other words, there was no scientific way to test it. Like every other cosmogony, it was a serious and sincere story meant to satisfy man's endless curiosity about where he came from and how he came to be so different from the animals around him. But it was still a story. It was not evidence. In short, it was sincere but sheer literature. So, as you see, it's a very challenging book to everything you may have ever been taught. And this comes from a PhD from Yale, much more recently graduated than Charles Darwin from the 1800s. Talk to you later.